From Adam onward, humanity has yielded over and over again to temptation. And we see that in the book of Deuteronomy. We see it as the people of Israel move from Egypt to the Promised Land and over again fall into temptation. As we hear in the very first reading for today, from the time you left Egypt until you entered the Promised Land, you have fallen into temptation. So the history of humanity, in many ways, is a history of falling into temptation, not being able to resist temptation, allowing ourselves to fall into sin. And the peak of that, as we hear in the book of Deuteronomy, is actually when the people of Israel are in the desert and they make a golden calf to worship. Imagine that. The image of a dumb beast to worship rather than the God who brought them out of Egypt with great signs and wonders and was giving them new life as they made their way to the Promised Land. In spite of all God's promises, all God's goodness, all the ways in which he showed the people of Israel his mercy and love, they sinned and even committed what is the equivalent of spiritual adultery by setting up another God in place of the God of Israel, who is the only true and loving God. And so Jesus enters into the wilderness in today's gospel, and he does what so many other people could not do. He overcomes temptation. He does not sin there. As for 40 days, he gives up food and drink and is alone with God in the desert. And there he encounters the evil one, Lucifer, but he does not fall into any of his temptations. And we know that he was tempted in 3 major ways near the end of his time in the desert. The devil really waited and chose his chance when Jesus was at his most tired. But Jesus didn't fall. What was his secret? Well, it's very clear. He prayed, he fasted, and he was watchful. All those things that we do in Lent. And it tells us something. We can pray, we can fast, and we can be watchful. And with God's grace, therefore, we also can overcome temptation. St. John Vianney, in a very beautiful wording, tells us all about this, how with Christ we can overcome temptation. Here's what St. John Vianney said, and I want to read it for you. Are we poor? We have a God who is born in a stable. Are we despised? We have a God who led the way, who was crowned with thorns, dressed in a filthy red cloak, and treated as a madman. Are we tormented by pain and suffering? Well, before our eyes, we have a God covered with wounds, dying in unimaginable pain. Are we being persecuted? How can we dare complain when we have a God who is being put to death by executioners? Finally, are we being tempted by the demon? We have our lovable Redeemer. He also was tempted by the demon. Therefore, no matter what sufferings, pains, or temptations we are experiencing, we always have everywhere our God leading the way for us and assuring us of victory as long as we genuinely desire it. Isn't that beautiful? Jesus is our model. He's our strength. He's our source of power in the Lenten season. And our prayer and fasting and our almsgiving, our watchfulness are all ways in which we conquer temptation through the grace of God just by simply cooperating and doing what we can. Perhaps this Lent, rather than fasting from bonbons and ice cream, as important as that can sometimes be, maybe we can fast from other things. I'm thinking of gossiping, fasting from unforgiveness, fasting from our screens, being purposeful and deciding to spend time in prayer in a very focused and regular way throughout the Lenten season, and being watchful. What do I mean by that? Trying to look at the world in a new way, with the eyes, with the mind, with the heart of Jesus, seeing in our neighbors the beauty and love that Jesus sees in them as he looks upon them, even those with whom we don't normally get along with. Now, I think that would be a true, wonderful, and beautiful fast this Lent. So we enter into the desert with our blessed Lord, and there's the good news. With Jesus, we can be assured of victory as long as we simply desire to conform our life to his, to enter into the desert with him, and yes, go to the cross with him, because we know that that cross and that desert leads us somewhere else, to another promised land, to Easter morn, to heaven, to salvation, to victory through our God. May God bless you.